Okay, I think that is my cue. A very warm welcome to everybody to this webinar on vulnerabilities in digital products. How does this impact the world around us? And I'm very pleased to give the first words and the words of welcome to Katharina Frey, who is the Deputy Head of the Digitalization Division of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Thank you. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maya. And thank you also for having asked me to send some words to you for the beginning for this first webinar out of a few I've understood. And I'm very glad that we could pick up again the Geneva Dialogue. Some of you might know we have had it. It has been established 5 years ago as an international process aiming to map the roles and responsibilities of actors in relation to responsible behavior in cyberspace. It has proved to be a much needed environment for regular conversations between leading industry actors and other stakeholders, engaging the private sector to deepen their understanding of existing security practices to reduce vulnerabilities. We have stopped for about a year, if I'm not mistaken. And again, I'm very glad that we could start again and that you're all taking place in this first webinar. In this regards, the Geneva Dialogue aims to contribute further to greater security and stability in cyberspace within the context of international peace and security. It seeks to identify good practices and possible gaps in existing efforts to ensure the implementation of international cyber norms and principles. Ideally, the Geneva Dialogue and our work will put forward the recommendations for overcoming such gaps. To achieve this in a truly multi-stakeholder approach, the dialogue should engage and will engage both companies and other communities, academia, civil society, and of course also technical experts from all over the world. This year, the Geneva Dialogue gathers representatives from these stakeholder groups to clarify the roles and responsibilities in line with existing cyber norms related to vulnerabilities reductions and the security of the supply chain. The dialogue aims to provide guidance on how to contribute to the implementations of those norms. The results shall be published in a Geneva manual on the non-state actors' implementations of voluntary norms for responsible behavior in cyberspace. With today's webinar, we aim to open a broader public conversations about these topics, and we also hope to reduce silos between the different groups. And we, of course, hope to bring more security to all of us in cyberspace. We invite you on behalf of the Swiss Foreign Ministry, and of course, also of DiploFoundation, and all the partners to follow and contribute to the work of the Geneva Dialogue. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you so much, Nina, for your introductory words and to put this, what we're doing here, into context. I think that is necessary and great to have you on board, Nina. Thank you for that. So to everybody here, I'm super excited that we are starting this journey now. And you can also be excited, I hope, because you are coming or starting with us. So as Nina said, this is the first event that we're having. The aim today is really to put everybody on the same basis to understand the first things about vulnerabilities in digital products and to understand also what kind of impact it has on all of us, on people, on companies, on states, etc. In this respect, we will have 3 short inputs from our esteemed guests here and speakers, who I will introduce in a minute. After each short input, it will be like 5 to 7 minutes input each. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 short questions. Please put your questions into the chat, and Nastya will be so kind and review and check the chat, and also will pose then these questions. And then we have a big block of time then in the end for Q&A and discuss around vulnerabilities in digital products and how it impacts us. I hope that is fine. With that, I will quickly introduce our 3 esteemed guest speakers today. We have Ivan Kwiatkowski. He is a senior security researcher in the global research and analysis team at Kaspersky, and he will talk about SolarWinds and how that came about. Then we have Natalia Krapiva. She is a tech legal counsel at Access Now. And the third speaker will be Stephen Sim. He is the chair of the executive committee of the OT ISAC, and he also leads the cybersecurity across a large logistics group. So I don't want to take more time of our content and our topic. And with that, I would like to give you the floor, Ivan, to start with your short input and the discussion of SolarWinds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Maybe before we dive into SolarWinds, the topic of today is digital vulnerabilities, right, and software vulnerabilities. So maybe it would be helpful if I explain in a few short words what we're talking about there. So the core idea here is when you have computer programs, those computer programs are likely to have problems in them because they are written by humans, and humans tend to make mistakes. And when they do, then those programs that they develop may have what we call bugs. So they may function in an unpredictable fashion, or they may have issues that were not thought of during development, and so on. And it turns out that something that's always very magical to me, that in some specific cases that I won't get into because there are technical details that we don't really care about, but it turns out that some of those software bugs that are introduced in software as they are being created, and I mean not on purpose, it turns out that some of those bugs can have security consequences. And that means that some of these bugs can be leveraged by users of the application, and this leads to a security compromise. It means that through the use of those bugs, through the specific use of the specific exploitation of those bugs, then attackers are able to take over the computer that is running those applications. So it means that if you are running an outdated program on your machine and you open a malicious document, then it's possible that an attacker is going to be able to run comments on your machine. And this is what we will be talking about today, I suppose, is what happens when attackers are able to do this, not just to individual users, but to companies. So in the specific case that we will talk about today, which is SolarWinds, this led to very mediatic and very high-profile consequences. So to give a little bit of background, SolarWinds is a US company that develops a software which is used to monitor IT assets. This software is called Orion. And SolarWinds in itself is not a very, I would say, juicy target when it comes to espionage or to the data that it hosts itself. But it turns out that SolarWinds did have many customers that are very high profile. They had customers in the US government, very prestigious US companies, and so on. And one day, some attacker somewhere figured that, okay, maybe they were not interested in SolarWinds in itself, but they were actually very much interested in whatever data the customers of SolarWinds possessed on their own computer systems. Now, what they did is they managed to find a way to breach into the computer systems of this company SolarWinds. They did so through a weak password that had been left for something like 2 years out in the open. And once they were inside the network of SolarWinds, they were able to gradually take over all the systems of the company. What they were interested in was the developer systems, the repositories where the source code of the company was located, the build machines that would take the source code, build it, and create the executables that would then be sent to all the customers of SolarWinds. And so what they did is when they were inside the company's network, they created their own modifications to the Orion software, where they added what we call a backdoor to the program. And I will get back to what it is a bit later, but they modified the legitimate application that this company was developing. And then through the normal process of distributing updates to the customers, then eventually over maybe a few weeks or month, then all the users of the company were infected with the virus that the attackers introduced into the program. And after this, then this backdoor was distributed to all the customers. It started sending messages to what we call the command and control servers of the backdoor. So overall, the mothership where from which the virus is being controlled. And then based on all the computers that were infected and starting to communicate with those command and control servers, then the attacker would choose which victims they felt were interesting to them. And this is how they got into machines in the US government or in specific security companies in the US as well. So there are a number of things that are actually not known about this campaign. For instance, we do not exactly know what the attackers were looking for. It is very likely that they were motivated by espionage purposes, that they were looking for intelligence on various US-centric information and organizations. But I think the key takeaway there is that securing one's IT systems is difficult enough, but it's also not enough at all. Because I suppose, I'm very sure that many of the organizations that were breached through this SolarWinds incident had very good security, but it turns out that this relationship of trust that they had with their IT suppliers was exploited. And it's a very, very good takeaway, I think, for everyone managing IT systems out there. It's not just about your own security, but it's also about the security of all your suppliers. Now, if you are 100% sure that nobody can get into your computers, then it's going to be, I think, well, it's going to be a very strong hypothesis that you're making there, but why not? But can you be sure that everyone that is providing you with software has perfect security as well? I do not think that anyone in the world can be sure of that, far from it. So here, I don't know, maybe later on we can go back to the consequences of the hack and so on, but as far as the takeaways go, for me, this was the one big lesson of the SolarWinds incident, is that, okay, software vulnerabilities are going to happen. These trust relationships that we have with suppliers are going to be exploited, and we should never assume that our IT systems have not been breached. In fact, we should always assume that they have been breached and start looking into our network to see if that happens to be true, which in many cases is going to be the case. It turns out that this specific incident has been discovered by a US company called FireEye, now Mendiant and now bought by Google. The details don't matter too much, but this was a security company that discovered this breach because it turned out that the attackers had targeted them as well. And so they were able to see that something was wrong because inside their own network, some unexpected behavior, network behavior was taking place. But had they not been looking at what was going on inside their own network, then it's very possible that this hack that affected, again, many organizations, including government organizations, it's very possible that this hack could have gone on for years or at least many months. So that would be, I guess, my short conclusion there, which is assume that you've been compromised and start looking into the network for traces of it instead of securing a network and like start from the assumption that if your network is secure enough, then nobody is ever going to get in.
Thank you so much, Ivan. Excellent start to our webinar here. Thanks for also explaining what vulnerabilities are in general, and then kind of going through this SolarWinds case, which to me, honestly, always sounds like a spy novel. It's well thought out and then set up, right? I take from what you have said, and I made a note out of that, that there is usually a relationship of trust towards your vendors, especially also your software vendors, which can then be exploited. And the result should be that actually everybody, gets a little bit or very much paranoid and does not easily trust into others, because it is difficult enough to understand and defend one's own systems, and one does not have all that information also towards its vendors. Hope that kind of summarized a little bit of what you said. I think we have a lot of chat activity already going. Do we have a question to what Ivan just said, Nastya, that we can pull out? Otherwise, we'll continue. And then
I think it's better to continue probably for now, and then later I will summarize a couple of more questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Ivan. Then I would hand over to you, Natalia, for the next case that we're discussing here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully I'll be successful. Good. Okay. And I'll share. Can you see the presentation? Great, great. Yes, so I would like to start today by talking about Pegasus spyware and what it is and what effect it has on human rights. Access Now, my organization, has been involved in investigating this spyware and also advocating against it. So we can share some of our work and something that we have learned. Let's see. So I'll start with a story to make it more interesting. So imagine it's the middle of the night. A lawyer in the UK wakes up from a notification on his phone. He has a missed WhatsApp call. He's a bit perplexed, not sure who it is, where it's from, but he's sleepy, so he decides to go back to sleep and check it out in the morning. However, when he wakes up the next day, the notification is gone. So he's confused, not sure what it is, but doesn't think much of it. However, what he doesn't know is that his device was silently infected with a spyware that is like a little spy in your pocket. It allows one to see your messages, your encrypted messages, your emails, your communications, and even have access to your microphone and camera and everything that's basically on your phone. And this is the spyware that is made by Israeli spyware company, NSO Group. So this, as we later learned, this lawyer was a part of the WhatsApp attack, which exploited the vulnerabilities in the WhatsApp app by the NSO Group, and he was one of the hundreds of victims. And he was, the attacker basically was able to install silently the spyware on his phone without his knowledge. And the lawyer, the UK lawyer, he doesn't want to be identified, but we know that he was at the time involved in representing victims actually of NSO spyware in Israel, victims from Canada and Mexico and others as well. So what is NSO? So NSO is as I said, it's Israeli company. It's founded in 2010. It's known by many different names in also different countries, but mostly we know it as NSO. And it's spyware. The main product is Pegasus, and a spyware exploits vulnerabilities that we called zero-day vulnerabilities, which has been explained already, but that are not known to the manufacturer. In this case, there was iPhone and Android devices were vulnerabilities were exploited, and the devices were infected with spyware without even the person knowing, as we've seen with this example. It's called zero-click vulnerability, which you don't need to click on anything to be infected. And you probably heard about Pegasus from the Pegasus project. That was a project by Amnesty International and Forbidden Stories. But for us, civil society, who have been working on the cases of spyware and Pegasus, we have been tracking it since at least 2016, when Citizen Lab broke their investigation on the UAE activist Ahmed Mansour has been infected with it, and then there were other subsequent stories in Mexico and around the world. Of course, Jamal Khashoggi and his associates and family were infected as well. The WhatsApp hacking scandal, then, which the lawyer in the story was part of, and more. Since then, and even in the recent year, we have seen a lot more new cases. One of them we were working on at Access Now at El Salvador cases, but there's also been cases in Poland, more in Mexico, in Thailand, in Europe, and so on. And it's not just NSO, right? There's also other companies on the market. There is Candiru, there is Predator, or Citrox, which produces the Predator spyware. There is a Hermit spyware. So there's other spyware that also exploit vulnerabilities and infect unsuspecting users. A lot of them are often civil society, which is our main concern. So what are the problems with this kind of vulnerabilities and the spyware? They violate human rights, basic human rights, right to privacy, right to freedom of opinion, expression, assembly, and association, especially in cases where we see people are targeted with spyware in retaliation for their work. So, for example, journalists are reporting on a corruption case, and we see that the government is infecting them with spyware to know what they're up to. Or activists as well, protesting or advocating for some issue, and again, they are infected and aggressively infected. We also see diplomats, officials as well, lawyers affected. In this case, we see attorney-client privileges being violated. It also threatens democracy, national security, and this digital security of our internet infrastructure and our devices. So just briefly highlight what are the solutions that we propose, the ways to combat these violations. We advocate for the global moratorium on the spyware, on the use, development, transfer, sale of spyware through Geneva Declaration and other efforts, and the UN experts have supported on this call as well as the government of Costa Rica. We also advocate for export controls, which we have seen in the EU and US. There's been some positive regulation that has been passed in that regard. We also support sanctions, and just this week we saw that President Biden signed an executive order that prohibits government use of commercial spyware. Earlier they also placed NSO and other companies on their blacklist. And investor engagement is also important, that investors also do not invest in companies that assist in human rights violations and facilitate abuses. Technical fixes as well, obviously, companies can close vulnerabilities that are discovered and are reported to them, and they make our products safer this way. And of course, litigation, which I also lead on and get involved in often, is there's also companies that are being sued now all over the world for targeting people through these vulnerabilities. And it's a very positive development, and we hope to see more of that. But the conclusion is basically that we need all of this because the industry has really become the wild west. Vulnerabilities are sold and bought and traded, and states use them to attack each other, attack dissidents, civil society journalists. So we should really have all hands on deck and to combat this issue. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you very much for your input, Natalia. Another spy novel, honestly, is interesting to see that not only companies or professional organizations are being targeted, but it's also the civil society, human beings that, you know, have something that somebody, you know, wants to spy on with partially grave consequences can be the target. A quick question to Nastya. Do we have any specific questions to Natalia that we should cover now, or do we wait for the end?
I think, let me check. This is just one question that has been posted in the chat, particularly I guess it's a question to Natalia, or as a community should be worried that after the US executive order, the government will hoard vulnerability discoveries. So I think there's also equal question to Ivan as well, if you wish to comment, and Stephen.
Was this a question whether the US government will hoard vulnerabilities?
Yeah.
I don't think this is going to be a result of the executive order. States have been doing that for years already. What we're talking about is a kind of a newer development that now it is available sort of off the shelf, and private companies are able to get this and sell them, some even relatively inexpensive, and that it just proliferated out of control. But certainly we should, overall, we advocate for all states and private companies to do the best, I mean, to basically stop this trade and hoarding and report vulnerabilities, because governments, I think, cannot have it both ways. They want to spy on people themselves, but they also don't want to be spied on, and so they have to limit their power and stop doing this as well themselves and not contribute to this problem. And I see that, I think, in some states, like there are some speculations, like within Israel, for example, as NSO is quite very close connected to Israeli intelligence agencies. And there is even some allegations that there might be like exchange, like government may be sharing some of those vulnerabilities with the companies. So there's definitely a lot of bad things going on, and definitely it's a call for both states and companies to take a responsibility. But I don't think the executive action is going to change. It's been the case for years before, but others can add. Yeah.
Thank you, Natalia, for that answer as well. And with this, I would like to lead over to our last input for today. It's again a totally different case. Please, Stephen.
Right. Thanks, Maya. Thank you for having me. I agree with Natalia. I think the government agencies have been hoarding vulnerabilities for the longest time, and we have seen that happening in the WannaCry and NotPetya, which were exploiting the Eternal Blue vulnerabilities. There were a lot of tool sets that were leaked out and then misused. But we can tip the asymmetry of attacks by sharing vulnerabilities across the community. That is how we can work together to find ourselves as part of collective defense. And that is where OTISAC comes into the picture as well. So OTISAC stands for Operational Technology, Cybersecurity Information Sharing Analysis Center. So we promote best practices and the sharing of threat intelligence among our membership. It was born out of the second key thrust of the OT Security Master Plan of the Singapore government. Yeah. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, feel free to check us out. So I'm going to give a short primer on what happened to the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident back in May 2021. It essentially disrupted the supply chain for essential fuel. So where you have heard earlier is on some of the supply chain attacks. especially SolarWinds. And this is focusing on an attack on the supply chain itself. And it affected consumers and airlines along the east coast of the United States, resulted in a shortage of gasoline, jet fuel, and home heating oil. The prices of fuel skyrocketed, resulting in panic buying and hoarding. Many of the domestic carriers could not continue operations, and the US government declared a state of emergency. In fact, it was the largest publicly disclosed critical infrastructure attack. And the attack itself was attributed to dark side APT groups. That's the name of the APT groups. They were using the dark side ransomware as a service. And nowadays, it is very easy to become a hacker. The low barriers of entries because such services are provided to affiliates. So these dark side APT groups, they stole 100 gig of data in a matter of hours, right? Took control of the took control of the IT network and disabled the accounting and billing systems for Colonial Pipelines. And the management team at Colonial Pipeline at that point in time made the call to shut down the OT pipelines. And the reason for that is because for safe measure to prevent damage, and because they don't have adequate visibility whether the attack has penetrated into the OT environment. So they also made the call to pay the ransom without consulting any regulatory bodies and so on and so forth. At least that was what was shared in publicly in the news. They made the call to pay the ransom of around US 5 million in Bitcoins for a slow decryption tool that was ineffective, right? So subsequently, the US government managed to claw back a substantial amount. Eventually, the pipeline was brought back up after 5 days after the breach itself. FBI offered a US 10 million reward for any more information on dark side. So that was how eager they were to find more information about this dark side ransomware. It was, as I shared, it was a ransomware as a service attack, and they are increasingly getting sophisticated. Ransomware used to be a single extortion, threaten, encrypt your systems, prevent them from working, and asking you to pay ransom, and then became double extortion. They leak your data out if you don't pay them the ransom. And nowadays it's triple or quadruple extortion with distributed denial of service. And it has become increasingly sophisticated over the years. And their modus operandi is attacks on, for dark side, is attacks on perimeter infrastructure, as well as using malicious emails with links to malware. They also exploit, very importantly, vulnerabilities with virtualization in the likes of VMware software, as well as VPNs for remote working, right? Virtual private networks. Notably, they allow vulnerabilities to be remotely breached, what we otherwise call as remote code execution or RC vulnerabilities. They also rely on tool sets that are already existing inside the environment, which are essentially in the industry, we call it living off the land kind of attacks. So the likes of scripting languages like PowerShell and so forth to bypass traditional defenses. And in the case of this Colonial Pipeline incident, there were, in fact, in my view, vulnerabilities exploited not just across the technology, but also people and process. The hackers had relied on the leaked employee's password. Yes, again, is the password. And it was reused on one of the legacy VPN servers that was not on multi-factor authentication, right? The employee had reused the VPN password on likely other non-company websites that were compromised. And that was the mistake that allowed the initial foothold. And from the initial foothold onto the IT network, the hackers were able to pivot, traverse the network, took control of the IT network, steal data, and eventually encrypt the IT systems. And so the vulnerabilities on how the architecture was designed and the vulnerabilities with the systems in the IT environment were exploited to cause the breach, and the rest is history. So the US government intervened, shutting off the key servers storing the leaked data, provided alternative fuel shipping strategies, and recover most of the paid ransom. So in this case, I feel that the partnership, public-private partnership, becomes very important. The government intervention is actually very important over here. And the Department of Transportation also levied nearly 1 million in fines against Colonial Pipeline for safety violations, which allegedly contributed to the pipeline's decision to temporarily shut down gas operations in the wake of the ransomware attack, which causes a massive disruption of the economy. And finally, the DHS-TSA also released new cybersecurity directives for pipelines soon after. It ordered pipelines to report any confirmed or potential cyber attacks, have a designated cybersecurity coordinator on call 24/7, review security practices, look for security gaps, and provide contingencies in business continuity plans. So in summary, my key takeaway is that the vulnerabilities goes beyond technologies and really goes into the processes and the humans. It's about hacking the humans as the weakest link. And it's really important for public-private partnership for governments and regulators to actually step in and influence the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that. I think that's also is a completely different case, right? It shows how then if we're also looking at the effects, and I want to go into that in a minute, how then some part of the critical infrastructure of a large country can be compromised, how that then has follow-on effects, partially because people are people, and people start stockpiling gas, and then a lot of the normal business and private endeavors are just put on ice because there is not enough there for everyone. I think that is highly interesting. I also thought that your final point on, if we're looking at vulnerabilities, partially the exploitation is not on the technical vulnerabilities, but it exploits processes or people, which I think is especially devious, but that is what is done, right? And I think that is something that we can keep in our minds. Great, thank you so much, all three of you. I think there is a lot there that we can discuss. I know there are tons of questions and discussions ongoing in the chat. But before we go there, I would like to just, because this year is, I think we have now 3 cases where we have seen that vulnerability led to very, very different organizations or people being impacted. And I want to just bring out a little bit more of how they were impacted, right? So we had on the one hand side, Ivan, who kind of talked about SolarWinds and companies, and other organizations were impacted. Then we had Natalia with the Pegasus example, where people were affected, like professional people, lawyers, journalists, and thus also part of the civil society. On Stephen's example, we had a critical infrastructure attack where everybody in that area, like in a regional area, was impacted heavily. Businesses, small businesses, families, all of that. So I think that shows the breadth of those impacts. Maybe Ivan, going back, you offered in the beginning that you could also go a little bit more into what happened then to those companies. What was the impact? Is that something that you feel comfortable talking about a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to talk about the impacts of those software vulnerabilities. So in my introduction, I talked about what these vulnerabilities are, and maybe some people in the audience were thinking, okay, some computers were breached, big whoop, who cares, right? So what is the impact of that? Sometimes it's my vacation photos that are being watched or accessed by some hacker from Latin America or whatever. It doesn't matter that much, right? Sometimes it's states that are able to spy on each other, and although it definitely matters, And although I'm happy to be on the sidelines to keep track of the score, I think probably states can sort that out between themselves. But just as Natalia explained through this Pegasus case, which I think is the most interesting of the ones we have at hand today, and by the way, Access Now, in my opinion, has been doing an amazing job in that space. In the case of those vulnerabilities that are used to spy on people, then the end result is that maybe some journalist somewhere ends up getting brutally murdered. And that's not something, that's very real and very important to think about. During my own research at Kaspersky, I've also been documenting some attacks on ethnic minorities in various countries in the world. We are, at the end of the day, talking about computer attacks, yes, but the end result is that people are getting killed. So blood is being spilled. And one of the questions that I thought was super interesting in the chat was, well, the blood is spilled, then on whose hands does it end up on? And this is a very, very interesting question. Is it the fault of the initial developer that initially created a vulnerable application? Is this the fault of the company that sold that application or distributed it to people without making sure that the proper security checks were in place? Is it the fault of the company that looked for those vulnerabilities and then sold them to clients? Is it the fault of the client who used those exploits to spy on people? The question there is probably best left to lawyers, but I think it's still very interesting to talk about, especially in the sense that it's not one that gets a lot of public interest, in my opinion. One thing that I would love to point out there is that we have built an entire industry, by which I mean the IT industry as a whole, the software development industry, that is constructed on offloading security risk to people. Now, if you buy or use any software such as Microsoft's Windows, if you use even Kaspersky's antivirus or WhatsApp or whatever, before you do, you will usually have to go through this very big end user license agreement that is maybe 100 pages long, as long as War and Peace, that nobody is ever going to read. And that essentially tells you that, well, whatever happens when you are using the software is not the responsibility of the software developer. They really tell you that security issues are possible, but whatever happens, they won't be liable for it, especially if someone gets dismembered in an embassy or something like this. So I think it's super interesting because it doesn't create incentives for software developers to make secure applications, right? They have their lawyer teams that say that basically they're covered, right? If the software turns out to be extremely insecure and turns out to have grave real-life consequences, it's not going to be their fault anyway. So in effect, it means that all the security risk is created by the software companies and then assumed by the users. And this is a situation that I think might or might not be extremely fair, and that we should be talking more about in this space.
And we will. Thank you for that. That was a very nice cue, Ivan, and I will come back to that, but we will exactly discuss this, what can be done and who should do it in the next webinar, which will happen on the 4th of April. So thank you for that kind of already passionate introduction of the topic. I know Natalia has put up her hand. Do you want to add to that, Natalia?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in terms of responsibility as a lawyer in the room, I want to say that we are at a stage where, as Ivan said, the harms are so severe that literally we see people being brutally murdered and tortured and disappeared for their activism, for speaking against the government, for reporting on important issues, that every person, in my opinion, and we have been trying to get to that point, that every company, everybody in this chain should be held accountable, because the facilitation of these egregious human rights violations cannot just be left unaddressed. But I want to say we also have to not forget that at the end of the day, who the users and the main attackers who are behind this are governments. And I know, like in SolarWinds, one thing that wasn't mentioned, that the attack was attributed to Russia, and and China and other countries are one of the top offenders in this regard. They are the ones who are brutally repressing civil society, waging wars in Ukraine and elsewhere. and are killing people, murdering and raping people. So this is something that we shouldn't be forgetting and omitting this part, that states are primarily responsible. They are the primary, there's a primary responsibility on them to respect human rights. And so this should be front and center. But companies as well that help facilitate these abuses, definitely we argue that they should be held accountable, and we hope to see already in courts the cases that are filed that we'll see that become.
Thanks, Natalia. I think, again, this is something that will be discussed in more detail, is on what can be done and who should do it. I think the liability and chain of liability is also part of an important discussion that we'll be having. I know Stephen has put up his hand again to maybe add to the impacts again on those vulnerabilities, what it means for people other than, and I think that is the most dire case in my view, is if people, get killed because of a vulnerability. I mean, that is really the worst case. There's also the case that just life gets disrupted, that, people, simple things cannot see their 80-year-old grandmother for her birthday, which is, a real bad thing, might be a really bad thing for a family, but also it costs a lot. I don't know, Stephen, if you can or have any data on the overall cost of the Colonial Pipeline event. That is something that you can talk about.
Yeah, I don't have, unfortunately, a lot of data about that. I just want to quickly add on to your point, as well as Natalia and Ivan's point. Really, truly, lives are at stake, and as you have rightfully pointed out, hospitals, emergency services have been disrupted. Hospitals, right, and medical devices, pacemakers. So we think about morbidity management. How are we going to patch a pacemaker? Do we pull it out from the body, patch it, and then put it back in again, right? So there's definitely been a lot of discussion about vulnerability management and about having the bug stop at the vendors and not pass it on to the end users like us, right? So I think I've seen good progress both at the Singapore site, where we came out with the cybersecurity labeling scheme for devices, IoT devices. And I noted that I think sometime earlier this month, the Biden-Harris administration came out with this 2023 National Cybersecurity Strategy, which shifts the responsibility onto software vendors. And I truly believe that that is in the right direction, to have equipment to be more security by design, right? Yeah. That's all.
To add to that, Stephen, in the European Union, we have new regulation coming up, the Cyber Resilience Act, which will have a big impact on the lifecycle security of connected devices. Yeah, I agree. Nice. Okay, so I put out one number that I know about, just because that I think is also just to kind of cover up here this discussion on the impacts. You mentioned that, I think, Ivan, or maybe Stephen, the NotPetya WannaCry and then NotPetya events in 2017. I think that is one number that is out there. It states the losses from NotPetya were larger than $10 billion US. I honestly believe, from knowing some of the insurance claims that have been settled, it's bigger than that. But that's the number that's out, larger than $10 billion US. Just to put also a price tag to that, is I cannot put a price tag to people's lives and livelihoods. So that is something that is, I think, on a completely different scale after all. With that, I would kind of look at you, Nastya, to come with questions from the chat and involve the audience at this point in time.
Yeah, I wanted to briefly give the summary of what we've been discussing so far, because there's a lot of discussions in the chat, which is really interesting to follow on. And there's so different directions, I would say, in the chat. So basically, it's really interesting to see that the audience, I think, is really nice. Puts the link between supply chains and vulnerability treatment, and also the trust in the supply chains, and it's been a good question. Also, how would you measure the trust, and how would you actually define the trust and decide trust or not trust? Then there's been a really good discussion about the liability, which would be also an element of the second webinar. We will dig a little bit deeply into that. Responsibilities, liabilities, and who actually is responsible for vulnerabilities in digital products. One of the other part of the discussion is, of course, about the people actually as the part of the vulnerabilities and the weakest link, which Stephen said before, and how could we also deal with this? Hacking people, social engineering, it's absolutely remains one of the hardest to fix in this regard. And I think one of the interesting questions is the dilemma between the risks of, politicization of the vulnerabilities, and also how could we more in a transparent manner develop security standards to regulate actually responsibility issues, and also to minimize the risk coming from vulnerabilities. So this is a very, I think, briefly, but I see that a couple of the questions were also Ivan already is ready to comment on. So probably Ivan, if you'd like to talk a little bit first about the liability as well. So that's one of the questions has been asked earlier, and maybe Natalia and Steven would be also open to comment. Thank you.
Well, here basically I just said what I wanted to say on the subject, so we can probably move on to another question. When it comes to liability, I think I've covered everything I wanted to.
Maya, in case you would like to give the floor also to Steven and Natalia.
Oh yeah, sorry, I just thought you had done that. Do you want to add to the liability question, Natalia? And
specifically about this, sorry, maybe was that something that I mentioned before, or is it a new question? Because I spoke about in terms of like accountability for who should be accountable for vulnerabilities.
Yeah, particularly the question here is about liability for the weak password, but I think the liability could be broadly interpreted as for overall poor practices that end up in vulnerabilities in digital products.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard. I mean, it depends, right? I would be cautious not to put any, not to do victim blaming, because these days, like you say, well, you could have, like with phishing, for example, you could say, well, you should know better not to click on links. And things like that, but it's becoming harder, as I said, with the zero-click vulnerabilities that you do not even see or anything, you don't know, and you don't click on anything, it infects you silently. Another trend that we are seeing as well is that just recently there was a case of a predator infection. Meta official in Greece, a Greek American Meta official was infected with predator, and there she received a message to confirm her corona vaccination appointment from the government. So again, and it looked just exactly like the government message with her information and everything. So these days it's becoming very, very difficult to discern what is an actually spyware or phishing or whatnot. And so it's hard to put responsibility, and we shouldn't, absolutely not, victim blame. In terms of the companies, though, they do have responsibility to make their products secure and not hide it if they discovered something, to patch it, to notify their users and try to remedy whatever harms came. And I really applaud WhatsApp and Apple that they not only did that, for example, in case with Pegasus, but they also sued the company. They're suing now in US courts, and we have intervened in the case of WhatsApp versus NSO, and they are looking for damages. And they are also to damages for themselves, as well as they're contributing to fund to also help develop cybersecurity research by civil society. So they're trying to also give back to the communities that are affected by these vulnerabilities. So this is, I think, an example, and more companies should join them in these efforts.
Yeah, I fully agree with Natalia as well. So I think it's really a shared responsibility model we are looking at, approach we are looking at. I recall the SolarWinds case if my memory had not failed me, the CEO of SolarWinds testified and blamed it on the interns. Correct me if I'm wrong. Blaming on the intern for using a weak password. I think it's SolarWinds 123. So, in the first place, governance, establishment of password controls and policies should be something that is under the due care of the security team, the policies, the standards, the compliance with those standards at the organization itself. So I think we have to call a spade a spade. So due care, I think it's everybody has their responsibilities on the due care aspects. Like a lot of folks, for instance, there are still folks falling to scams. Do you blame the banks? Do you blame yourself for falling down? I think there's this shared responsibility. Each of us must play our part as part of the ecosystem. And I just want to quickly touch on the point about the trade-off between convenience and security. I think it doesn't mean that it's a zero-sum game. We are increasingly seeing promises in that area. For instance, passwordless, how we can make authentication more secure without needing to remember complex passwords, make it frictionless as much as possible. So I think the whole idea for cybersecurity is to make it as frictionless as possible for the consumers so that they don't find workarounds that bypass the security controls, yet maintain the security level for them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Nastya, do we have any last question from the chat?
I would probably call out one of the questions about whether vulnerabilities can be abused for political reasons. I think a good question that could be made a link to the security. So the question is there any risk that the fear of breaches due to vulnerabilities could lead to restrictions in brands and versions of smartphones or overall technology? So that's the question that has been asked from Manu Ari Oroktamba. Hope that I pronounced correctly. Let us know if anybody would like also to discuss some bits of that.
Can you repeat again the question? Sorry.
Is there any risk that particularly the fear of breaches due to vulnerabilities could lead to restrictions on a particular technology?
I don't know if they're talking about TikTok ban or something like this, but
yeah, the parallel is made here about the TikTok, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's our position has been is that there is a good reason to take a look at all companies and you know, and I think restrictions, blockings of platforms are not human rights compliant. This is something that shouldn't be done, whether that's in US or in Russia or anywhere else. But definitely we should ask for require more from social media companies in terms of their data protection, data privacy measures. And there are questions to TikTok, there are questions to other companies as well. But those issues aside, there is also a legitimate concern of company, you know, cooperating with the Chinese government, and the same can be said about some of the Russian companies like VK or others. That you know, these are also legitimate concerns, but we do think that the measures by US governments and other European governments to block TikTok are completely disproportionate, given all of those concerns even. So anyway, it is true, it is a risk. It is becoming very popular to ban, when in doubt, just ban and shut down internet or shut down a platform. This is definitely not justified and disproportionate, and we argue against these practices.
Thank you, Natalia. I think we are at time. I would like to give each of you the benefit of stating one last sentence that you want to leave the audience with. I hope that's fine. Ivan, would you like to start? What's your kind of takeaway message for the audience from this vulnerability discussion?
Yeah, I do have a short closing statement. Since this is a webinar organized from the DiploFoundation, I would like to say a few words to diplomats out there who might be listening. Turns out that if you want to make the internet a safer space, then of course you have all my support on this, and I think this is something we should do. But this is something that Natalia mentioned, and I think it's super important, is the fact that the main offenders there are governments. And so making the internet safer is going to involve making sure that governments impose limits on their own powers. And this is something that is going to be extremely counterintuitive for them. So I would say that this is going to be the main difficulties you're going to be facing. I wish you good luck for this because you have your work cut out for you, but it's still something extremely important to do, and we need you on this.
Thank you, Ivan. Excellent. Natalia, your takeaway for the audience?
Yes, for the audience, the general audience, I would want to just say, take a look at your phone and think about everything that you have there, that you use it for, the types of information that is there that you might want to protect. And it's not just high-level politicians these days or high-level journalists and so on. Anybody is now, unfortunately, susceptible to this kind of attacks. And so it is really a common thing that we share that we should advocate for. And so when the governments as well, whether you live in, if you live in a democratic country that you think, well, my government may not want to spy on me, but there are laws, unfortunately, that are also pushed, like defeating encryption and so on, that making the systems weaker, that we should still push back against, because it will weaken the security for all of us around the world. So be vigilant about this.
Thank you, Natalia. And Stephen, your takeaway for the audience.
Yeah, thank you. I think vulnerabilities are really across technologies, processes, and people. I know there are questions about how to do it. I think what is how to exercise due care. There are many ways to skin the cat. Pardon me for cat lovers. There are really many ways to manage vulnerabilities. Even earlier on, there was a mention about whether do you want to selectively choose certain products, maybe those tied to certain nation actors that you do not want to use. So the general approach is to diversify your risks, to limit concentration into specific products, and all these and many more. It is really about coming together as an ecosystem to share best practices and threat intelligence, whether it's OTISAC, whether it's the Geneva Dialogue, to share deeper on these best practices on the how, some pragmatic approaches that I don't think we can finish it in this short 1 hour, but perhaps other future sessions we can focus a lot more about the practitioner's approach and so forth. Yeah, so it's really about the ecosystem, keep the asymmetry against our perpetrators. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. 3 excellent takeaways. Thank you so much, Ivan, Natalia, and Stephen, for giving your expertise here. Thank you so much, Nina, for your input, and you're welcome, and for the Swiss government to support this initiative. Thank you, Diplo, for organizing this. And please, audience, don't forget, on the 4th of April, we will have the next session that goes deeper then into what can be done about those vulnerabilities and who is actually responsible to do something about it. So I think it's going to be really exciting again. So thank you, everybody, for joining, for your engaged discussion, for your questions, and I hope to see you all again next time. Have a great afternoon, day, evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.